to finish in terms of item 7 on measurement, but the plan is that we move on now into item 8, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. We'll then go on to the ED78 item, and we'll come back to measurement after that, most likely tomorrow. We obviously need to see how we make progress today, but if we do have to sort of, reduce the time available for an item, it'll be natural resources that will sort of act as a buffer, and apologies for that, Lindy, and also Edwin, but we'll see how we get on. It's always, agenda management is always an art rather than a science, so we'll see how we go today. Ross, anything else on a general plane? No? Okay, good. So I think without further ado, hand over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, so we're up to agenda item 8, which is ED79, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. And the aim of this session is to get this ED approved so that it can be issued early next year with the other suite of standards, measurement, IPSAS 17, conceptual framework, etc. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm having a bit of trouble with this morning, so fingers crossed it's going to work. So you should just have the front screen, the front slide there.
It looks good, Jo.
Yeah, okay, great. So the first agenda item 8.2.1, and just to throw something into the mix, we have revised our recommendation that was in the paper, and we are now recommending that we do not add disclosures on surplus assets and assets to be transferred into IPSAS 17 and IPSAS 31. The reason for this is we received some comments back from jurisdictions, and I'd like to thank those members who did send their comments back. We were asked whether we were going to define what a surplus asset was. Now, we hadn't considered defining this because we consider that it's actually a management decision about when an asset becomes surplus. Also, IPSAS 17 refers to idle assets and assets that are retired from active use, and IFRS 5 and therefore ED 79 refers to abandoned assets, and neither of those types of assets have been defined. We also thought that the disclosures that we were proposing to add into these other standards were not a consequential amendment from adopting an aligned standard from IFRS 5. They don't actually relate to assets held for sale. They are actually outside the scope of the standard. We also noted that IPSAS 17 has voluntary disclosures on idle assets. So, and we decided that taking that all into account, we considered that this was actually outside the project scope. Remember, this is a narrow scope project to align with IFRS 5. Therefore, we are now recommending that we do not add any extra disclosures into IPSAS 17 or IPSAS 31. So I will leave that to the board to discuss.
Thanks, Jo. Ross, you wanted to come in before I open it to the board.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and again, echo Jo's thanks to members for their kind of stand back and kind of highlighting this issue and Jo's clear explanation of it. I think it was helpful to kind of have that stand back and make sure we were kind of seeing the forest for the trees on whether we were actually helping with this proposed disclosure. So that's why we've revised the recommendation since the papers have been posted, and kind of seeing if we're doing this alignment project, this disclosure on surplus assets was likely to raise more comments on that unrelated issue, or I guess loosely related issue, and not focus people on the very clear, concise CD that is meant to be an alignment project. And also caused us to re-examine whether we needed that disclosure, given there already are disclosures in IPSAS 17 on idle and retired assets. which we think the surplus assets disclosures would be duplicating to some extent. So, and again, we'd still like to get approval of this ED at this meeting because we want to clear the agenda time for the big package we have coming. So we do think this is ready. It's really just taking out those proposed disclosures, and then we can consider in the future where we might deal with this issue if we deal with it.
Okay, so thanks, Joe and Ross, for that introduction. So any members disagree with staff and want to push for inclusion of the disclosures? So I've got Todd.
I certainly don't want to push for the inclusion of the disclosures. What I would like to do, though, is just clarify in terms of paper 8.2.1 that there is going to be the adjustment within the reconciliations to, in showing the reconciliation, disclose any assets that have been reclassified in the year. So it's not that the paper has got a line put through everything. We are still going to retain, if you look at the box on page 8 of this agenda paper, we would retain 88E2, is that right? But not the other changes? And the same then for 117, is that what we're going to do? Yeah, I just want to clarify that.
Yeah.
Because that is a consequential, is it not, of 79?
Yes. So what we would be doing is retaining the change to 88E2, and then what we have got as an additional at 88E2B would move up to the end of 88.2E, which is in line with IFRS 5.
Okay, thank you.
So that's how it is actually in IAS 16 as a consequential from IFRS 5, and the same with IPSAS 31 from, or I can't remember the equivalent IFRS for intangibles.
Sorry, so just for clarification, that will be a consequential then from ED 79.
Yeah, so part of that paragraph 88 is actually a consequential from IFRS 5, but not the bit about the transferred assets.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that clarification. Okay, so with that, I've seen thumbs up to the response and the clarification that Todd gave. So I think we can, sorry, Patricia.
I have one question. I'm not sure about the that the assets are allocated for transfer is a sub-item of assets classified as held for sale, and is the same in other disposals. I think it's not a sub-item, but different items.
So the proposal is that bit on transferred assets, we're not going to include that at all.
Yes, yes, because this I think that no include in two, but need to add the other lines. It's not a subgroup of the asset classified as held for sale. My question is, assets allocated for transfer is not a subgroup of assets classified as held for sale. This is my question. It's not the way then the way that the assets you disclose, will be disclosed.
David,
yes.
you want?
Yeah, just to clarify, Patricia, what the proposal is that we completely align with IFRS 5 in this area, and so we, in the paper that you've got, the line that is in the box as 88E2A, assets allocated for transfer, that that section will be deleted so that we actually totally align with the consequential amendment that is in IFRS 5. So it won't be there at all.
My question is not in relation. My question is not in relation to align with IFRS in terms of scope, but I think it's for example, I can have PPE and in operation, and I can have PPE the goods initially recognized as PPE as assets classified as held, and or assets allocated to transfer. But assets allocated for transit is not a subgroup of assets classified as held for sale. This is my question.
That's correct.
It's yes, it's only instead IIA, it's a III 3. I don't know when I say it's not asset allocated for transit. It's presented here as a subgroup of assets classified as held. And for me, it's not correct.
Yeah, that is correct. It's not a subset of assets held for sale.
Yes. Not a subset. It's a different set. Yes.
Yeah. So what was presented in the paper, I did actually put that disclosure in the incorrect place, but we are now recommending that we don't include that disclosure at all, that it's not included anywhere.
No, it's only in the correct sect, not yes, only in the correct sect. My question is only correct sect. Yeah, but I recommend the disclosure.
So you want to include the disclosure on transfers?
Yes.
Can we have that discussion in the context of ED 78, please? Because it's not an ED 79 issue. It's actually something that we need. If you want to have that discussion, it has to be in the context, I think, of ED 78, because it's not a consequential of ED 79, because it doesn't come anywhere near ED 79. Because transfers are not items held for sale. So if you want to have that discussion, can we have that in the context of ED 78, please? I want to stick to ED 79. Now, does anybody else disagree with the staff recommendation that we stick with the disclosures for ED 79? So I've got Lynn and Camira still in on this. So can we move through this quickly, because I think we're wasting time on something that actually is a peripheral issue, if I'm honest. Lynn.
So maybe we pick it up in, as you suggested, in the other ED. I think we need to explain ourselves very carefully in the communications here on ED 79, that we have therefore really narrowed our scope, because when we initially discussed this, we saw value in those additional disclosures. And maybe we pick that up in ED 78, but we need to explain ourselves in ED 79 so that we don't just get all our constituents saying there's value in these other disclosures. Why didn't you think about that? So I think we need to communicate. If we're going very narrow, we need to communicate that we have gone very narrow and why.
Well, I think we haven't narrowed it. Basically, we're sticking with ED 70 with IFRS 5 scope. We haven't expanded it. That's the point. We've kept it.
I agree. I agree with that.
Them all along that people have been trying to expand the scope, and we're not. We're aligning it. Now, the point is that the disclosures in IPSAS 17 that are also, that's already there in terms of surplus assets. So the question is, actually, do we change that in 78? But I think it's not a direct consequential of ED 79.
No, my point is that we need to explain that we've gone for a narrow alignment project carefully.
So conclusions and communication to deal with that. And I think there are some issues that we will need to pick up in the basis for conclusions. But this, in terms of this, we don't need to make the amendment here is the point. I'll take Camira and then back to Ross.
Yes, thanks. My question is related to the due process, because we receive in the agenda item, we receive the opposite recommendation. And now if we are voting, should we then vote against the recommendation? Because it's what is written in the agenda. If we change that in the presentation now, it will only be documented in the minutes perhaps. So that's my question. Maybe Ross can help me clarify that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Camira.
So on this discussion, just to clarify on 2 points, this project in the strategy and work plan was always to do a strict IFRS 5 alignment project. The exploration of the issue and the need for surplus assets within this project is completely within the scope of the board's decision, but reverting to a complete IFRS 5 alignment project poses no problems, but we'll need to communicate that in the communication. In terms of due process, we'll minute the decisions the board makes today. There's no need to revise agenda papers. This happens quite often. We're taking something out of the ED. We'll be clear on what's being taken out when we minute it, and there's no problem. From a due process perspective, it'll be clear the ED that we're putting out for comment and what it has to say to constituents, and they'll comment on that ED. So we're at no issue with due process whatsoever on this.
Thanks for that clarification, Ross. Thomas, and then I want to move us on because I don't think we're making progress on this.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just to kind of say that I support what Lynn just said in terms of communication. I think looking back to the discussion of the CAG in the June 2020 meeting, I think there was the same question. Is it a pure alignment project? Is it looking at identical transactions, or is it including similar transactions, which means transfer assets? So I think there would be support from the CAG for that approach in ED 79, but it needs to be clearly communicated, especially the interlinkage between 79 and 78. I think that's all.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, I think this is the problem all the way through, is frankly, people are trying to expand the scope, and there's been a lack of clarity about the relationship between 79 and 78. So I think if we have an instruction to staff, which is, and this isn't in, and for the sake of clarification, when we get to vote on this, we will need something in the basis for conclusions just to clarify this, that it's dealt with elsewhere, that we have considered it, but the basis for conclusions are non-authoritative. So when we're voting on the authoritative material. Okay, so with that, we make the consequential in terms of surplus assets, disclosures, and then we move on to the next item, please.
Okay. So the next agenda item is 8.2.2, and this is where the board had instructed staff to develop an additional disclosure to be included in ED 79, so it is within the scope of the fair value of assets that are carried at a lower, that are measured at a carrying amount lower than fair value. And this was for accountability and transparency reasons. We note that IPSAS 17 has a similar disclosure, even though it is voluntary for assets that are carried on the cost model, that their fair value should be presented in the notes to the financial statements. So we have developed an additional disclosure which states that when materially different, the fair value of an asset should be disclosed in the notes when the value is different to the carrying amount, when the fair value is materially different to the carrying amount. I will note that probably the placement needs a bit of refining, and this will be going through a editorial process, a drafting group. So I just like to open that up to the board to discuss whether they agree with the disclosure as it is written.
Thanks, Joe. So that responds to the recommendation from last time round. And as you said, as per all our pronouncements when they go out, there will be the editorial process. So that is designed to ensure that the small minor wording changes that need to be picked up and consistency and so on do not make a substantive difference to what the board has voted on. And there is a control process with Ross then making an assertion to me that on whether any of the changes are substantive and need to be brought back to the board. So, you know, if there are minor edits that members have got, those can go through that process. Okay, Lucy.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I noticed inconsistency, or perhaps, as you said, maybe it can be a drafting issue. But in the additional disclosure in paragraph 51E, it says that when the carrying amount, or where it is materially different, the amount of the assets classified as held for sale, I'm sorry, when the amount of the asset classified for sale is materially different from the fair value of the non-current asset or the disposal group should be disclosed in the notes. However, in BC11, as presented in paragraph 6, it provides that the fair value of the non-current assets classified as held for sale shall be disclosed when such asset is measured at a carrying amount lower than fair value. So hence, under the proposed BC, it would appear that regardless of the difference between the fair value and the carrying amount, the fair value has to be disclosed as long as the carrying amount is lower than the fair value. So it looks like the materiality requirement in the proposed additional disclosures was no longer considered in the proposed BC. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Lucy. So just to clarify, you're content with the proposed disclosure. It's the basis for conclusions that you think needs revision to be consistent with the proposed disclosure.
Yes, Chair. So that there will be no confusion that because if the carrying amount is lower, for instance, by $1 or 1 peso than the fair value, then it looks like that in the BC this has to be disclosed in the notes to FS.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so we have to still carry the materiality requirement, and of course, it would be based on professional judgment also. That disclosure requirement should be really material enough the difference should be really material enough to warrant a disclosure in the notes to financial statement.
Okay.
So I suggest revision in the BC. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for that. So I've got Thomas, then Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just to say that in the already mentioned discussion in June, I think when the CAG supported keeping the option between carrying value versus fair value less cost to sell, they said the difference between these two values would be interesting to public sector users. So kind of looking at the discussion that would support the recommended disclosure. Just one remark regarding materiality. I think there was also a discussion within the CAG regarding the materiality concepts, which are different for preparers on one side and auditors on the other side. So probably what we cause here, it might be a discussion in the future about how to define materiality. But just to mention that, I think still it should be material because definitely it requires a lot of effort to kind of identify the fair value, but just to say it might be a point of discussion.
Thanks, Thomas, for reminding that. So I think there's an instruction to staff that we should actually note that the board had that advice from the CAG and actually you know, we're consistent with the advice from the CAG on that. And you're right in terms of materiality. Obviously, one of the potential projects that we will need to pick up is the you know, the work that ISB has done on materiality, which of course has been done alongside the International Assurance and Accounting Audit and Assurance Board. So, okay, so I've got Todd next.
Thanks, Ian. I just wanted to pick up on Joe's point about the placement of this particular disclosure requirement. It's currently sitting in as paragraph 51E. If you actually read the lead-in to the ABCDE, it talks about not only where something's been classified as held for sale, it also says or sold. And I think we don't want this disclosure in 51E if the asset's actually been sold. So I think that means that it may need a separate paragraph or something for it to make sense.
Thanks, Todd. That's a good point.
Yeah, so I intend to make it a standalone disclosure and not include it with others.
Okay, thanks. So I think we're in agreement with that. So basically we agree the disclosure, it needs to be placed in a separate paragraph. We need to pick up on Lucy's point in terms of bringing in materiality for the basis of conclusions. And we also need to reflect the fact that we had advice from the CAG, which we've implemented in terms of how we've, in terms of additional disclosure. And we'll come later to the SMC on that as well.
Thanks. So moving on to agenda item 8.2.3. So this was a question raised at the last meeting about whether ED 79 would apply if it was difficult to ascertain the fair value of an asset. Now, we discussed this, the board sponsor and I discussed this, and we consider that part of the requirement for an asset to be classified as held for sale is that it must be actively marketed at a price that it's near its fair value. Also, we consider that if an entity is intending to sell its asset, then it should actually have some idea of what that fair value is. Further, with the introduction of the IFRS 13 based fair value measurement in the measurement project, we consider that actually getting a fair value for assets should be easier in the future. So therefore, we recommend that there's no action on this instruction. Ian, you're on mute.
Sorry. Open up for comments then. Anybody disagree with staff's analysis on this? Okay, not seeing any hands, so I think we agree that.
So this is where we come to agenda item 8.2.4, where we have put together all the other instructions to staff that we didn't consider warranted separate papers. So we are recommending no action is required on these instructions. So the first one is guidance for transferred assets. Now this instruction came up in regards to machinery of government changes, but where some jurisdictions will transfer assets at their carrying amount, and then the receiving entity will recognise them at their carrying amount. Whether we should include any guidance. Now, this guidance would be in IPSAS 17 and IPSAS 31, so therefore it is also really outside the scope of this project. We also consider that there is guidance in IPSAS 17 and IPSAS 31 on derecognition of assets, and then also in IPSAS 40 on recognition of assets. If a jurisdiction decides to transfer those assets at their carrying amount, we consider that's a jurisdictional issue, and therefore it's not really for the IPSASB to make comment on how jurisdictions may wish to apply the standards that make it easier for them in those circumstances. The second issue is the linkages between IPSAS 16, which is investment property, and IPSAS 17 regarding surplus assets.
Joe, sorry, can I just stop you a moment? I want to go point by point on this to make sure that nobody disagrees. Okay, so I think we're fine on the first point. So take us on to the second one.
So the second issue is the linkages between investment property and property, plant and equipment regarding surplus assets. We note that in IPSAS 16 investment property, that even if an investment property is idle and not being used, it is still accounted for under that standard until it is reclassified for use as like an owner occupied property. So there, we could not find any linkages apart from the consequential amendments that arose from IPSAS IFRS 5 that were included in the consequential amendments part. So we consider there's no further action on there.
Okay, so just pause and pick up on that. Anybody disagree with that? No. Okay, so move us on to the next one, Joe.
So the third point is that the at a glance document should articulate that transferred assets are outside the scope of IFRS ED 79, and to develop a scope diagram for ED 79 about which assets are and outside the scope depending on where they are in their life cycle. Please note that the appendix that was added to this paper is a work in progress. If anyone's got any suggestions on how to make that diagram pretty, I would love to hear it. But we will be working on, so what we gave you was basically a first draft. For those who are new to the board and not aware, the at a glance document is a document that we do issue. It's a staff document we issue when we issue either consultations or IPSAS's pronouncements to give an overview of what we're proposing or what the standard would include.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So request to members if there are any comments to give those to Joe offline. We're not going to draft a diagram in the session. Okay, Joe, move us on to the next point. Todd.
I just wanted to note that I actually found the at a glance and the way that it had been put together quite helpful. So I'm sure that, you know, people with better skills than I would have might be able to come up with a slightly better presentation, but what's there is actually helpful. So well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Todd. And I think communication is going to be something we'll come back to on this package, because obviously there are a lot of linkages and so on. So I think that visual is going to be really important, not just for this project, but for a number of the other projects as well. Okay, Joe, move us on to the next one.
So the next item was whether the use of commercial transaction was appropriate in IPSAS. Now we do note that commercial transaction, or the word commercial, is used throughout IPSASs. ED 79 is intended to apply to those sales that are of a commercial nature. Therefore, we consider that that term, there's no problem with using that term.
Thanks, Joe. Anybody disagree with staff analysis on that? Okay, no hands raised, so we're happy with that recommendation from staff.
The next issue was the interactions between IPSAS 32 Service Concession Arrangements Grantor and ED 79. I went through IPSAS 32, and so from my understanding that a service concession asset is never intended to be sold. It may be given to a grantor, to an operator to use but the control of the asset retains with the grantor, because they can state the circumstances and any fees that associate, so like toll fees, or they will set the toll fees for the operator to receive. There's no intention in 32 that such an asset will be sold. Control is retained with the grantor, therefore we don't actually consider that there is any interaction that needs consideration in this project.
Thanks, Jo. Anybody disagree with that assessment? Thomas?
Not actually a disagreement, but just a question. Like in lease contracts, in some of the contracts, there might be a kind of a clause that at the end of the term, the operator can buy the asset, like in a lease term as well. So there might be a link. I'm not so sure whether you thought about that or how we deal with that.
I mean, Ross, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I think in terms, there might be cases where there would be a clause like that in a contract, but if you read the service concession standard, it's clear that while the contract's in place, the service concession entity still retains control of the asset, and the contract guides its use, which is why they retain control. So in terms of held for sale, I don't think there is any interrelation. Service concession arrangements are quite long in nature, so I'm not sure how you would have a service concession arrangement ongoing and also have the asset held for sale for the period of the arrangement at the end. So I think this is a very, you might have instances that you could find on the margins where this might be the case, but I don't think it's an issue at all in IFRS 5, and I don't think we need to do anything on it.
Thanks, Ross. Thomas, I mean, I think this is a measurement issue. It's not an IFRS 5 issue, from my experience of accounting for PPP schemes.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree for the time during the contract. So probably it's coming in sequence. So first you have IPSAS 32, and then you have IFRS 5 or like ED 79. So it might come off each one after the other and not in parallel. I agree with that.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so Jo takes on to the next point.
So the final point in this paper was to consider any linkages between IFRS 5 and IFRS 3 in regards to discontinued operations, disclosures for discontinued operations. We went through IFRS 5 and IFRS 3 thoroughly, and although there are some consequential amendments that do arise from IFRS 3 from ED 79 that will impact IPSAS 40, which is the equivalent of IFRS 3. We couldn't find any that actually related to discontinued operations. All those consequential amendments have been included in the appendix to ED 79 as an amendment. So we didn't consider there was any further action on this item.
Okay, we're content that's been picked up as a consequential amendment. Good, okay, thanks, Jo. So move us on.
Moving on. So the next paper, which is 8.2.5, is regarding specific matters for comments. Now we have only recommended including one SMC. Generally, we would only include an SMC where we have diverged from the IFRS standard, so from IFRS 5, and the only divergence we have recommended is the inclusion of that disclosure of the fair value of assets that are measured at a carrying amount that is materially different to that fair value. So we're not recommending any more SMCs in this ED, but we'll open that up to the board to discuss.
Any comments on that? Obviously, there might be a few bits of finessing on drafting and so on, but generally people happy with that approach. Mike.
You're on mute, Mike.
Presumably, Joe, thank you, Chair. Is the reference to paragraph 51E still correct?
We will make that amendment when we decide where we're going to put it. So that'll go through the editorial process. It's most likely that that disclosure will become paragraph 52 and everything else will change, will follow down, but we need to look at that.
Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, so now we get to the amendments to other IPSAS, Joe.
Sorry, it's hard to unmute yourself when there's slides on the screen. Appendix B to agenda item 8.3.1, which is the draft ED, has all the proposed amendments to other IPSASs. Now, we did take a thorough process. We searched on key phrases like held for sale, discontinued operations, disposal group, also on IFRS 5. Now, we did that for all IPSASs and all IFRSs. So we're confident that we have picked up all the amendments that need to be made to other IPSASs. So just the recommendation is that you accept these amendments. I suppose if there's any editorials, that'll obviously go through the editorial process, and if they could, people could send those through to me. But I'm pretty confident we've got them all.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Any major omissions that members or TA have identified? No, okay. Good, thanks for that. And as Joe said, obviously, if there are any minor edits or anything like that, those can go through the editorial process.
Okay, so the next agenda item is 8.2.7, and this is the basis for conclusions. Again, this will go through the editorial process, and we will make the amendments regarding the first decision about not including those disclosures on transferred assets and surplus assets. So that what you have at the moment says that we will be including those disclosures. We will revise that basis for conclusion to say why we're not. We will make sure that the basis indicates that this is a very narrow scope project. It is to align with IFRS 5 and not expand the scope at all. So we have the drafting that you have, that I did provide the drafting where it is at the moment. It probably needs refinement, but if there's anything major that needs to be included or removed, we'd like to hear that. Otherwise, whether we just agree with the direction that we're going.
Okay, so I think we picked up one other change, which is Lucy's point on materiality also needs to be addressed, and that's in relation to the consistency with proposed new disclosure. So that needs to be made. Any other points members have? Patricia, and then Mike. I've got first hands now. Patricia.
Thank you. During the review of material, I think about the one point in relation to the in the amendments, for example, about the cash flow in the page 50, item C, DBCs. In base for conclusions, in relation to the amendment in page 50, item C. There are explanations about the kind of operations in the public sector, but in BCs, I didn't identify in these proposed BC, I didn't identify the return to the discussion. Maybe it's important to clarify the change in the decision by the board. In particular, I think in paragraph BC, the proposed BC paragraph BC 8, page 75. In the last phrase, approach the question, change from operational capacity to financial capacity. And the change to operational capacity to financial capacity is related to non-cash generation assets too. And it's clear for you.
You understand?
Yeah. Yeah. My question is before the draft, there was discussion about the operation in public sector.
Yeah.
In this proposed draft, the discussion disappeared. And I think that one point is it's a relevant point because the change to operational capacity to financial capacity is related to non-generate assets too. It's only to communicate, not change in the scope or the drive, but communication in BC. Yeah,
I think I understand. Yeah. So I think I understand. So if we have a cash generating unit, a cash generating asset that we then hold for sale, then your capacity is not going to change. But if you have a non-cash generating asset and then you hold it for sale, then you are changing from operational capacity to financial capacity. So I think we just need to reflect that in the BC.
Yeah. And during the, I'm not sure about it the moment, but it's linked to this because during the analysis of the draft, in my view, the assets, non-generate assets, it's sale individually and not in group of in disposal group. Maybe the clarification about this is important too. Oh, yeah. I followed the rationale in relation to impairment rules about impairment. Impairment with cash generation is I can consider the group, but in impairment of non-generation assets, I consider the individual assets. I think it's the same rationale in relation to the assets for sale too. But my question is only to continue the decision before not in here it's not mentioned about this. So only the BCs, only the communication by BCs.
I think I understand.
Okay, so I think there's some drafting clarification that needs to be done there, working with Patricia. We just need to be careful because this comes back in again to the scope, that this is about an alignment, and that there may well be that actually, you know, this issue is actually really an ED 78 issue. And we also need to be careful that we're not providing guidance in the BCs that should actually be elsewhere. So I think it may be that actually there is only a limited drafting amendment here, and it may well relate back to guidance elsewhere. Ross, you wanted to come in on that before I go to the other members.
Yeah, I wanted to make the point that you were just making, Ian, because I think linking what you do when you sell an asset to basically say non-generating assets would be sold as one, I don't think it's the same thing as impairment. So I'd be careful what we say in the BCs there. I agree with your point, Patricia, and we'll work with you to get the wording right. But I think we should be careful we don't over-explain what might happen in a sale, because I think when you're selling an asset, that's much different than measuring it for impairment. And you can think of many different types of sale arrangements. So I don't think we should be making any assertions on what a sale might look like.
This may also come into some of the discussions we're going to have in relation to ED 77 guidance. Okay, so I've got Mike, then Lucy, then Mark.
Thanks, Chair. So, Joe, we've very slightly changed the definition of a non-cash generating, of a cash generating unit from the IFRS definition to the IPSAS 26 definition. Does that require a BC, or was it just such a small change it's not worth commenting on?
Ross, can I have a view on that, please?
I think we'll have another look at that, Mike, and make sure if there is something we put it in, but I would guess we're talking about the cash generating unit as explained in our standards already. So I don't think we need to explain much there other than just noting that.
Okay.
Thanks for that clarification, Ross. Lucy and then Mark.
Thanks, Chair. Actually, I have the same issue with Mike. I share his comment on that because I noticed that there is really no corresponding BC to the recommendation on the use of the IPSAS 26 definition of cash generating unit instead of the IFRS definition as discussed in agenda item 8.2.8. Of course, subject to the board's decision agreeing to the staff and board sponsor recommendation in agenda 8.2.8 on the definition of cash generating unit, I think there should be a corresponding BC to explain the departure from IFRS 5. Although, as Ross mentioned, we have been using this definition already in IPSAS 26. But I think there should be an explanation on the decision of the board to depart in this particular ED to depart from the IFRS 5 since it would be outside of the alignment project. It would mean departure from the alignment project. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. So, Ross, you'll pick that one up.
Yeah.
Okay, so go to Mark.
Apologies, I was not quick enough in the previous agenda item to push the raise hand button. So I'd like to have a brief comment on the amendments, if it's possible. It's in IPSAS, amendment to IPSAS 40, is an amendment to paragraph 89A, which is the same as the IFRS 3 paragraph 31. And the question is, because we also have the amalgamations in our standard.
Can you just give us the page reference where you are?
The page reference, no, I don't have them in hand because I just make the notes.
Oh, okay.
I think it's the amendment to paragraph 89A in IPSAS 40.
Right, so I was just trying to make sure everybody understood where we were within the papers.
Do
you mean 84A?
Or is it 84A?
84A, it's page 72.
Page 72. Okay.
72, 49 of the ED, 72 of the whole package.
Okay, and the question is more, what if the case is covered if we have an amalgamations and one of the units is actually the unit where something has to be sold to, what happens in this case, because IFRS 3 doesn't talk about amalgamations, because usually you would just end up adding the book values, but in this case you would maybe most probably have to do more, because you would sell it. It would be an internal transaction. So the question is, does it has to be additionally, have to say something additionally about this case?
So you're considering in the case of an amalgamation, if you actually receive an asset that you want to immediately classify as held for sale?
Yes, but to the entity you're going to amalgamate with. So you previously had before you had classified it to this entity, but then because you amalgamate with her, maybe it's not an asset held for sale anymore.
Yeah, I don't think those would classify as assets held for sale, Mark, because you're not selling them commercial means. That's a transfer to another public sector entity. So that's outside the scope of IFRS 5. So there shouldn't be any consequentials for that. And I don't think we need to add anything.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Linda,
you.
you on BCs?
Yeah, I have a different view on that one, but perhaps we can.
Can we take that outside, please? So I think we take that one offline, because there clearly is a difference of view. Okay. So I think we were back on BCs. Was there anything else? I had one comment as a member, actually, which was we had and I think it's quite an important issue in terms of the length of time that assets can remain not available for sale within the scope of the standard. And I think probably there's an additional sentence or two that's required, really, just to articulate that. You know, we did have a separate paper on it, and it is quite an important point that you can have property that sits there for quite a long while before it actually is available because of regulatory and other issues. So I think we just need a sentence or two that explains that we have had that debate.
Noted.
Ross?
Yeah, just to clarify that, Ian, you're meaning in the BCs, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Noted. Yeah. We can develop that. You're right. We did have that discussion.
It just is, you know, I'm not, it's just getting the thinking explicit rather than implicit as it is at the moment.
Okay. Moving on. Apologies, my neighbour has just started playing his piano and his dog's howling, if you can hear that. So the next agenda item is 8.2.8, and this is what Lizvi had commented and Mike had raised as well, that we are only proposing to change the definition for cash generating unit and to use the definition in IPSAS 26 to be consistent across all IPSASs. We also note that IFRS 5 defines fair value and also value and use. We have removed those from the definitions list and referred that to the measurement ED, and that'll be dependent on what comes up in ED 77 for those definitions. So if does anyone have any disagreement with the approach taken there?
Anybody disagree with that? Mike?
I'm agreeing, Joe. I just want to make sure I'm being consistent with the ED on leases. Maybe I'll just talk to Joao about that offhand, or if Joao's listening to us, can he, because we had this not a dissimilar discussion about fair value in that.
Yeah, can we take that offline?
We didn't want to make that change there.
Okay. Sorry, I think we're fine with that. So move us on, Joe.
Okay. So the next slide is just for the approval of ED 79. I'm presuming we're going to do a page-by-page review, and then that will be subject to amendments will be made, and then we'll go through the editorial process with an editorial group. But if we can do that and then get approval for the ED, we have suggested a 4-month comment period, so we may want to comment on that now. But the idea is that all these EDs will go out together.
We're not going to talk about comment period now. I think we'll pick that up in the context of the package as a whole.
Okay.
So in terms of walking us through, Ross, can you actually take us through the pages so that I can watch to see if members raise their hands?
Sure, Ian, just let me get oriented to the first page of the ED. So the first page of the ED starts on page 25, the numbered page 25, which 25 of 90 of your PDF, that's the cover. And we have the, on page 26, we have the regular internal cover of the document. Page 27, we have the request for comments, the standard guide for respondents. Page 28, the table of contents. Page 29 is objective and scope.
Lindy.
Thank you. I just picked it up now. I guess we would need a table of comparison to IFRS 5 also to be included in the document.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That's an instruction to staff because it's obviously non-authoritative.
Noted. On to page 30, continuation of scope and the start of the definitions. Page 31, continuation of the definitions.
Lucy.
Thanks, Chair. I just noticed some these inconsistencies. Oh, I'm sorry. We changed the term business to operation, but the term business here appears in the ED. So I suggest that we be consistent in the use of operation instead of business. And there are other terms that we change from IFRS 5 to this ED, but we still carried the terms used in IFRS 5. So just for the staff to look at those inconsistencies.
Yeah, thank you. I've already noted that one. That I noticed further down, we've got business combination. It should be public sector combination. So there are a few editorials that we've already picked up that we will change.
Okay, thanks. So Lucy, if you can pass those over to Joe, that would be much appreciated.
Yes, I will email to Joe the version that I have already corrected or reviewed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Lucy. Okay, so carry on, Ross, going through.
Page 32. Page 33. Page 34. Page 35. Page 36, start of presentation and disclosure. Page 37. Page 38. Page 39, effective date and transition. Page 40. Page 41. Page 42. Page 43, amendments to other IPSAS start. Page 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53.
Ajith.
Yeah, I'm referring to BC 9 in page 53. The BC 9 refers to a situation where the fair value less cost to sale is more than the carrying value of the asset. And the first sentence talks about the recognition of the gain, and then the second sentence says there's actually no recognition of, there's actually no gain. So the wording is not clear as to whether what we're trying to say. It looks like what we're trying to say is that we have considered whether there is a gain or not. But that is not reflected in the first sentence. So that's what I was trying to. The first sentence said it must be noted that in circumstances where the assets are measured using historical cost model and the carrying amount is lower than the fair value plus cost to sale, and it would need to recognize an increase in value, either as revenue or as a gain on revaluation. I think the first sentence is not quite right. The second sentence clarifies that the IPSASB concluded that such an increase in value did not meet the recognition criteria for revenue, nor was the recognition of the gain on revaluation appropriate under the historical cost model. The second sentence is correct. The first sentence doesn't seem to be correct. It looks like we're trying to say that we have considered that situation, but the first sentence actually says in circumstances that situation arises, but that gain doesn't arise.
I was having trouble hearing you. I think probably what you need to do is actually send your suggested drafting through to Joe and Ross for them to have a look at and see if we can just get the clarification that you're looking for to that BC. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
And I think that comment was on page 53 of the ED, not, I think we jumped ahead to the BCs of the actual document. We have to go back on the page by page, and I think we were at page 38.
Yeah, okay. So I think, notwithstanding that, Ajith, if you can send through your suggested clarification to staff, that would be helpful. Okay, so take us back to the page. And
we go on 53 actually.
Sorry, Ajith.
We go on page 53.
Yeah, but I think there's two page numbers in the document. I was on page 53 of the PDF, and you were on page 53 of the ED. So,
Yeah.
So it's actually page 30 of the PDF, 53 of the ED, and we'll just continue on with page 31 of the PDF, 54 of the ED. Sorry, 54 of the ED. 32. 33. 34. 35. 36. 37. 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, and we're now into the BCs again.
Yeah.
53, we've already noted BC 9, work with Ajith to get the wording right on that one. 54, into implementation guidance. 55.
Probably at that point, Ross, as it's non-authoritative, we can just say, can we take any further comments that members have on implementation guidance?
Agreed.
Okay.
And as always, if there are edits that people have, please send them to staff by, I would say, Wednesday of next week at the latest. Actually, Friday of next week should be fine. We're not going to be publishing this immediately, but we want to start the editorial process immediately after the meeting.
Okay, so I think that takes us through the standard. I think we have the slight change in terms of the positioning separate paragraph of that additional disclosure in the authoritative text. There's a possible query where we've got a potential difference of views between Mark, Ross and Lindy that needs resolving on the consequential amendments. So those are the only two changes that I note, or one positioning change and one potential issue on the consequential amendments. Those are the only changes I note to the authoritative part of the standard. We have got, by my calculation, probably 4 or 5 changes to the basis for conclusions that need to be made. Those are non-authoritative. The question I think now is, are the board content to move to a vote at this stage? Or do you want to see the revised BCs before you vote? We will see the BCs back, obviously, because that is the board thinking, and we need to make sure we as a board are happy. But again, to underline, those are non-authoritative, and therefore we can change those after the vote. So, Mike.
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy to vote. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody not happy to vote at this stage? Okay. So, Ross, take us into the formal process, please.
Thanks. So again, as on Monday when voting, so first I'm asking, do any members wish to vote against this ED? If so, please raise your hand now. I'm not seeing any raised hands, so 0 votes against. Does any member wish to abstain from voting? Abstain from voting on this? If so, please raise your hand using the comment button. I'm not seeing any abstentions. And if you choose to approve this, please remain silent, so don't raise your hand. So I'm not seeing any hands raised, and I don't believe we have Chris, so that would mean we have 2 absents today, James Jung and Chris, for purposes of noting the vote. So that's 16 members for, 0 against, 0 abstentions, and 2 absent. So the pronouncement's approved. Sorry, the ED is approved.
You're on mute, Ian.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks very much for everyone for the comments. I would like to note that David has been the board sponsor on this, so thanks, David, for the time you've taken in terms of discussion and debate with staff. So in terms of forward process, Joe, we will need to see the updated basis for conclusions in advance of Tuesday, so that we can just go through that and make sure those points are picked up. Joe or Ross, anything else that we need to do at this stage?
No, I think we're good. Just want to thank the board and thank David for his input, and also Ross and Dave Warren. They've also been very instrumental in getting this through, so thank you very much. And again, thank you to all the members who provided comments, and I'm happy to receive many more.
Okay, so that's good. And obviously, as I said earlier on, we will have a look at the exposure period, because this clearly, as we've seen, has potential interactions, or people will have questions about how this fits with our other literature, in particular the IPSAS 17 update, ED 78. So we need to make sure that this goes as a package and people see it as a package in commenting back on that. Okay, so I think with that, that takes us through the first part of today's session. I think given how well we've done thus far, I think we'll take a break until past. So thanks everyone for your input thus far. And if we come back at past, and then we'll move into ED 78. Okay, thanks everyone.
1 minute warning.
Okay, so welcome back everyone. I think we now move on to the ED78 item. As with yesterday and measurement, another very much team effort. So in terms of the overall program management and the interaction with the measurement projects, Dave has been in the lead on that, supported by Eileen. And then obviously we've got Gwenda on the more heritage-led areas and Amon on the more infrastructure-led areas. So we're going to lead between the various different members of staff as we progress through the various items today. But I think, Dave, you're going to lead us off.
Yes, I will. So I will kick off, as Ian said, with a quick overview of what we did this quarter. I think it's important because as we have a few projects coming together and we're managing them as one or considering them from a holistic point of view, I think it's good for members to have an understanding of the process that we followed. This quarter, what the big focus was to get through all the conceptual issues so that the IPSASB was able to provide some direction, at least a first time at this September meeting. In that regard, I think Gwenda and Amon have done a really good job in going through and identifying all the issues that the IPSASB had previously identified at previous meetings and making sure that we've addressed them all for September. In this regard, we also leaned heavily on the task force this quarter. So firstly, I'd like to thank all the members on the task force for volunteering their time and really helping us there. And one aspect that was a little different in how we used the task force this quarter is that in addition to reviewing all the papers and helping us with the appropriate answers or the appropriate recommendations, the task force also helped the team earlier in the process. And what I mean by this is there were two specific phases that the task force helped with. And the first one was to really help identify what the issue was. And what we found a lot was that we had a big list of issues that related to heritage and infrastructure. And often these were shorthand issues from constituents. So as an example, we'd have an issue that indicated constituents didn't know whether they should recognize significant parts of property, plant, and equipment or infrastructure assets. And where the team was struggling a little is that in the standard, it is clear that you do have to recognize individual parts of property, plant, and equipment. But as we talked to the task force and leaned on their expertise and reached out to other individuals, it became more clear that the question wasn't so much whether you have to recognize individual parts of property, plant, and equipment, but how do you identify these individual parts? So as a result, that really helped focus the team and help us develop the issue and bring it to a better place for this September meeting. The second aspect that we leaned on the task force for was once we really identified the issues and really flushed them out, whether this was an issue that needed to be addressed. So each issue that was originally identified by the IPSASB went through these two phases, and then issues papers were developed. And sorry, I should have advanced the slides because this is all the issues that Amon and Gwenda developed for you this quarter, and we'll go through them one by one after I take you through this next section on changes we made to ED72. But Ian, I'll stop here for a second to see whether members have any questions on process.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I mean, I think, you know, just to thank staff for the, this is quite a complex program management exercise, both in terms of content and also in terms of issues management. And I think it's actually been done very comprehensively. So having seen that, I think, you know, as well as what's gone in the papers, what's gone on underneath that, I think from a, you know, on behalf of the board, should thank staff for what they've done here. Is quite complex, pulling all this together and making sure that we've picked up everything. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions. I think people are happy with the way in which the process has been taken forward.
So moving into the first, I'll call it an issue, but it's just the changes we made to ED 78 as a result of instructions from the IPSASB at the July meeting. I'll go through this the same way that I have in the June and July meeting and just outline on each slide the change we made. So the first change that I wanted to highlight to the IPSASB are terminology changes. And the first instruction from the IPSASB was to go through and make sure that we're using consistent terminology with the measurement project. And the second instruction was to go through and use PP&E terminology consistently. So this is where instead of using property, plant, and equipment, asset, or item, that we pick terms and use them consistently. What I've suggested, at least for September, is that we do this as part of Q4 as we're really tightening up the document. So this is more for your information slide that this is in process and will remain as an instruction in the first section of the agenda items.
And just for clarification, we're expecting that the board will that the board will next see this in December in terms of discussions, but you'll make sure that that's been done in time for that, so those changes will be picked up.
Correct. So the other slides where we've actioned the items, they will drop off the instruction list, and we'll just keep the ones that I think there's 3 that we haven't actioned yet. And yes, you'll see those in December.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So the next item that I want to take the IPSASB through relates to definitions. And there are a couple of components to this. The first was where we had defined terms that were now defined in the measurement project. The instruction was to add the generic wording at the bottom of the definition section that says, please refer to IPSAS measurement. I've added that in, and I've added a running list of terms that we will refer to IPSAS measurement as these projects work together and are being developed. And the second instruction related to a specific definition, entity-specific value. And one of the members asked that we look at that and determine whether specific wording related to cash flow should be excluded from that definition. When I reviewed the definitions again in ED 78, when I looked at entity-specific value, and there are some other terms that were now defined in IPSAS 21 and 26, everywhere that I could find a term that was defined in another standard, I removed it from the definitions and simply referred to the other standard. I thought it was a cleaner way of doing it, and I thought it would be less confusing for constituents, and it's in line with our practices.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I think we're concerned with the process that's been gone through. Okay.
So the next slide relates to moving a paragraph from paragraph 8 to AG 16. The general concept here was what's included in the initial cost of property, plant, and equipment. This provided some guidance on spare parts and how to include those. The instruction from July was this supported the core principle and should be moved to application guidance.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised. Okay, move us on.
The next section relates to, it was a fairly easy change because the IPSASB added guidance on control. There was no longer a need to write as an asset after property, plant, and equipment throughout the standard. So as a result, we just actioned the IPSASB instruction to remove the term add an asset throughout the standard.
Okay, I think we're fine with that. Thanks, Dave.
The next change relates to really just combining two paragraphs. Old paragraph 11 and 12. Paragraph 11 used to say you measure property, plant, and equipment at cost. Paragraph 12 said unless cost was not determinable, then you have to use, unless it was a non-exchange transaction, then you apply fair value. The instruction was to combine these two paragraphs, and that's what we've done.
Okay, I think we're fine with that. Lindy.
I said, and I've forgotten how to use the mute button. Just a comment though, so I know we reverted back to non-exchange, but in the consequential amendments in ED 71, we amending IPSAS 17 on this. So I guess at some point we're going to have to decide how we're going to handle where there is no cost, or if, I guess it links to the conceptual framework discussion we had yesterday as well.
Thanks, Linda. Yes, it certainly sounds like a sort of ED 77 issue, and we've got that section on initial measurement, initial recognition coming back in October. Okay, Dave, move us on. Thanks for that, Lindy.
So the first, I'll call it big change. In July, if you remember, there were a few paragraphs where there were some members that were fairly, or had numerous comments on certain paragraphs. So as a result, staff took those away with what I'll call a small drafting group and really focused on these paragraphs. And the one big change that came out of this, we actioned all the editorial comments, but the one big change that came out of this related to a few paragraphs that I had drafted, I'll say for the June meeting, where I was trying to help constituents decide how to make an accounting policy choice, whether to record your property, plant, and equipment at historical cost or in IPSAS 17 at fair value. And there was, I'd say in the June and July meeting, there was concern, and with the drafting group, we tried to address these concerns. And when I was able to jump on a call with one of the members of the group, and we talked it through, what really came through was the challenge in the paragraph that I had developed was I was trying to clarify how to apply an accounting policy choice. And because the accounting policy choice rests with the preparer, there's not much to clarify. So this wasn't core text. And what we concluded was that actually the best place to do this was to address this in the board and provide guidance on what historical cost provides to financial statement users and what fair value provides to financial statement users. And we thought BC was the most appropriate place to do this because you're just helping constituents understand what users see from either using a historical cost measure or a current value measure. I did check with the other members of the group and everyone supported this as well. So this is a change that staff recommends going forward to address the accounting policy choice extra guidance.
Thanks, Dave, for highlighting that. Anybody disagree with the proposed way forward? No? Okay, I think we're fine with that.
So the next, again, significant change, and this is the last one, relates to, and this goes back to my comments yesterday in the measurement session where I was reviewing the historical cost guidance in ED measurement and considering an IPSASB comment from July to read ED 78 in its totality and review guidance that had been taken out and make sure ED 78 still reads appropriately. Considering both those comments together, some of the guidance that had originally been moved to ED measurement has been moved back to ED 78, and that addresses both comments. One, it makes the historical cost appendix in ED measurement more principle based, and it also makes ED 78 I'll say read better as well.
Any comments on that? Okay, thanks, Dave. I think we're fine on that.
So the next slide is just moving guidance related to elements of cost to AGs, because again, this supports the core principle that was outlined in IPSAS 17, and the IPSASB instructed that it was more relevant as supportive guidance in the application guidance.
Okay, not seeing any comments on that, so I think that's agreed.
The next change was to address an instruction that we should add in the list of classes of property, plant, and equipment, an example for a heritage item. I added that. I think I also added one for infrastructure assets as well, and that's in paragraph 32.
Okay, not seeing any hands raised. That's fine.
The next slide relates to an instruction to make sure that we included references to ED 79, so Joe's project that you just went through. Specifically, the instruction was to change paragraph 57. We did go through all of ED 78 and made sure that we picked up all the references to ED 79 that should be there.
Okay, I think we're fine with that.
This is the other change that will be addressed in Q4, and this goes back to where depreciation sits. I think from my perspective, I'm a little clearer now. At the June and July meeting, I indicated I didn't know where I was going to propose that the depreciation guidance sits, whether we move it to historical cost in ED measurement. I think based on the recommendation that we stay at a more principles-based level in ED 77 measurement, I think I'm going to propose or recommend that depreciation stay in ED 78. So this will be cleaned up in Q4, but this is still an outstanding instruction for Q4.
Okay, so I think we note the sort of that's the tentative proposal at the moment, but to be confirmed. And Dave, it might be helpful just to pick that up, given the focus for the October check-in will be on ED 77. We might just, you know, assume update the board, if you like, on whether that proposal remains at that stage.
That's a good point, Ina. I'll note that down. And then the last change we have relates to, in the basis for conclusions, BC6 and BC7 were repetitive. I deleted BC7.
Okay. I think we'll have to have a good look at the BC material, actually. Certainly, I think I've got some comments on that, and I think we will need to have a look at that when we see that all together after we've looked at the various different issues. I guess, Dave, at this point, sorry, Todd.
I can recollect at an earlier meeting raising the issue of subsequent cost, and I think at that stage, everything to do with subsequent cost was in the application guidance, and I did note a concern that, in my view, it felt like we needed some reference to subsequent costs in the actual standard to then provide application guidance about it, and it doesn't look like that's been addressed. I don't know whether it was missed in terms of being picked up as a matter that had been raised that needed to be addressed, but I still remain of the view that it does, and so I thought I'd raise it under this agenda item because it didn't seem to come up anywhere else.
Thanks, Todd. Dave, back on that. I mean, obviously, we will have a discussion. We've got paper 9.2.4, but I think you're right, Todd. It's the substantive guidance that would, authoritative guidance that would hang off.
So Todd, I've noted down your comment and I'll make it instruction and I will bring it forward in Q4.
Okay, that's good. And I think, I mean, Todd, you came in on what I was going to ask members, which is, has anybody got any other comments on either the core text or the AGs? Because when this comes back, what we'd like to do is accept the changes that have been made thus far, and then just give you the markup for changes made subsequent to this meeting as a result of outstanding instructions or consistency with other material and guidance. So is there anything else anybody wants to raise at this stage? Otherwise, we'll instruct staff to accept the changes in the authoritative text, i.e. the core text and AGs. Okay. Good, thanks for that. Dave, anything else from you at this stage?
No, we're into the issue items now.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so I think it's Gwenda first, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. So I'll introduce this issue, and it's building, as Dave said, on the work that the task force did in terms of identifying issues to address and also how to address them. And each issue that we deal with in this has been through task force review. So I think in all cases, we actually have a task force recommendation. So this first issue, 9.2.3, is about control over heritage. And the task force has recommended to the board that this be addressed, these heritage-related issues be addressed through implementation guidance, which you can see in Appendix A. And remember that the board has already added authoritative guidance into the standard on control and including application guidance. So this builds on that. And it addresses basically control issues raised through comment on the consultation paper and by board members on museum collection items, where they're held in storage, are they controlled? And the guidance says yes. Where they're held for a short period, for example, on loan from another museum, and the guidance is saying no. And then where they hold on a sort of indefinite basis, because the museum has these items still owned by another entity, but basically the museum is expected to hold them throughout their useful life on an indefinite basis in an open-ended way. And in that case, the guidance is saying they are controlled. So the question for the board is, do you disagree with the task force's recommendation? Over to the board.
And as with all of this, if there are minor editorials, obviously those can be picked up through, can be given to staff. So Lucy, you start us off, and then I've got Lynn and Todd.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I concur in the recommendation of the task force that a question and answer approach on control over items in the heritage collection be included in Appendix A and as part of the IG. However, I strongly suggest that we consider providing also illustrative examples on control over heritage items so that we can provide clearer guidance on controls, because the controls on heritage asset is really very contentious, and from the perspective of an implementer or constituent, I would like to see in the standard that, for instance, if there are some gray areas in the IG, then when we go down or drill down to the illustrative examples, the the principles could be best understood or could be easily understood so that the implementation will be facilitated. So let us not limit our guidance only on the IG, but we have to consider also possible illustrative examples so that we can help our constituents better. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I mean, I think it raises the general debate that we've had backwards and forwards over the last year, actually, about how much guidance should we give, because we have to be careful that we're providing principle-based guidance rather than rules-based guidance. So I think in reviewing these, you know, the implementation guidance questions, the question is that question on the right area, the right principle? And we should be very wary of providing implementation guidance because of not moving into rules. So I think in making the case for an implementation example, the question is what is not clear and therefore needs to be clarified, and what is the case for an implementation example in addition to an IG? That's really the question. So I think if members can think about, have we asked the right questions through the implementation guidance, and then is there a real demonstrable case for further clarification which has to be dealt with through an IE? Because unless there is, I think where we have to go is the presumption is there should not be implementation examples just because it gets into rules rather than principles. So I think that's really, back to your point, Lucy, I think really the question is there a principle that we're missing, you know, that needs further elaboration? Because we can always provide more guidance and we just get into rules and more problems that way. So I think that's the challenge with all of these points. So I'll leave that thought out there for the moment and move on to Lynn and to Todd. No.
Thanks, Ian. So I thought what's been done here is helpful. I did have a question mark in my mind, and it's on the IG2 perhaps versus IG5. And what we've said in IG2 is really clear that if we're holding a heritage item for a very short defined period of time, then we don't have control. And then in IG5, we flip to the complete opposite, which is we're holding it indefinitely, but we don't have legal ownership. Then of course we've got control. But where people are going to struggle is in the middle ground. How short is short defined period in IG2? If I'm not in a short defined period, but I'm not indefinite, am I into phase 2 of the leasing project? Is it a commercial arrangement that puts me into phase 1 of the leasing project? So I felt there was something more we needed to do around how on a principles basis we would determine control when we're not in one extreme or the other.
I mean, essentially what you're talking about is judgment, Lynn. And I wonder whether actually the way, perhaps what we should consider on this is whether we actually need to just make that point in the basis for conclusions, because, you know, it's going to come down to the practicalities of each case. You know, what it says in the loan agreement, under what circumstances you could have an asset, you as the owner could have the asset back and so on. So it does seem to me to be hard, unless anybody else has got some really good examples of how you could provide principle-based guidance, to have guidance on that. But I do think that perhaps we're missing some commentary in the basis for conclusions that makes exactly the point that it's on the circumstances of the case, and then you go back up to the general requirements that the general guidance we put in on control.
I do agree. I wonder if we are clear on this loan agreement, so maybe we need to pick it up in phase 2 of the leasing project, but there is a piece for me about loan agreements of heritage assets. Which standard am I in?
I mean, I think it does come back to what is, you know, what precisely is the question we're asking, because we could put everything into the leasing project and then, you know, I don't know what more guidance we can give than we've given additional guidance on control. I mean, perhaps I'll go to the staff at this point, see if there are any ideas of comparable issues, because otherwise we're just kicking the can down the road. Ross, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on this.
I do. I think we have added some additional principles to help clarify control up front on this issue. So I'd be a little bit leery at adding a much more in implementation guidance, because we've actually, in this case, provided authoritative guidance that should help entities determine whether they have control or not for the purposes of the asset. And I think that's the lease issue. I'm not sure I'd want to get into in a discussion on control per se, because there are lots of other aspects as well you could also go in. It's kind of, you start writing rules at that point. So I think that's where the apprehension comes in the implementation guidance.
And I just wanted to add, you know, we're carefully focused on the property, plant and equipment, not the right to use. We're, in this guidance, we're trying not to go down the leasing perspective, and it's quite tricky not to get pulled into that area. And so, I mean, I do like what Ian was saying about judgment, but I'm also hearing, Lynn, that you've said it felt helpful because we are trying to address a sense of museum collections on a short-term basis from another museum. You know, and one of the characteristics of heritage is that people are usually very clear about who really controls it. It's not like leasing where you're trying to blur the boundaries. So I think I should stop there, because if I say too much, we'll start a great discussion about loans and leases. But part of the reason we're being, if you like, extreme is to address the two issues that were raised with us, without getting into leasing.
I mean, looking at this then, I mean, IG5 is essentially saying, you know, you may nonetheless have control. And I wonder whether actually what we should do here is in IG5, just actually make a reference back to the additional application guidance that we've included on control and say, you need to consider those factors in the round, because we've got 4 factors there. And I can't see how we can actually write guidance that says something else other than consider those 4 factors. Lindy, you were trying to get in. You got a good brainwave on this one.
Well, I think what would help, especially for IG2, and I don't know how you number the examples. I think if you compare the length of the period of use, so the contract period, compared to the useful life of the heritage assets. So if we say it's an indefinite period of use in terms of the arrangement and the asset is has an indefinite life, then you probably have control. But if it's for a shorter period and the asset has an indefinite or very, you know, we forget the term we're going to use, then you don't have control. And I think it's as simple as that.
Thanks, Lindy. I saw thumbs up and nods to that. I think that would help you if we just sort of recast it in that way. Okay, thanks. That sounds like a good way forward on that. So that's the instruction to staff that we need to make those revisions in accordance with Linda's suggestion. So I've got Todd, then Adrienne.
Thanks, Ian. I've got a couple of comments, one on the implementation guidance and one on the application guidance. And the one on the implementation guidance, the very first question was quite a strange one when I thought about it, because we're saying, does a reporting entity retain control over something depending on where it's situated. And that just comes across as quite strange. It's sort of like, you know, if my car's parked in the garage, do I control it versus is it parked on the street? I mean, is it in storage or is it being displayed? I wondered what we were really trying to get at with that question, because it didn't quite resonate with me in terms of why would we actually be asking that question and answering it. I don't know what the issue is that's led to that question and answer. So that was my first point. In terms of AG 14, which is sitting in Appendix B, I was reflecting on that, and in particular the sentence right at the end of AG 14 where it talks about an entity being likely to demonstrate control if it satisfies most of the indicators, which means, you know, some people are going to look at that and say, well, I have to have at least 3, if not 4 of those, otherwise I don't control it. And I don't think it's quite that black and white. So I do wonder whether we may need to change that sentence at the bottom of AG 14 to talk about, I don't know, maybe the more of these indicators you have, the more likely it is that you'll demonstrate control. But at the end of the day, it's judgment around whether you control, and perhaps we need to sort of say, you know, that it is judgment at the end of the day, and, you know, only one entity can control at the end of the day. So you do need to weigh up a number of things and think about it in terms of making that judgment.
Thanks, Todd. So I think in terms of your suggestion on AG 14, that certainly sounds sensible to refine it in that way. Gwenda, do you want to go back on Todd's point on the question?
Well, I just acknowledge his reaction to that first question. We did discuss it with the task force, whether this was about future economic benefits and service potential or control, and we got the clear direction to make it about control. I guess in terms of moving it forward, I don't think that the present guidance hurts, and that would be an argument to stay with it. On the other hand, if there's a sense that it's not really helping and it's actually kind of confusing, we could take it out.
I mean, just to fill in some of the discussion, I think the point was that there has been a point that's come up, which is people want to not recognise heritage items because they're not on display. And so it was essentially actually saying, absolutely, if you've got that in your collection, regardless of whether it's actually on display or not, you actually have the ability to present that. The fact that you haven't chosen to at that point in time doesn't stop it being an asset. And that was really the, you know, just wanting to really make that point. So, you know, that was why it was there. I mean, you know, maybe we just flip it and have it as the last question so that you don't hit it first. And, you know, but that did seem to be a misapprehension. I mean, I remember that question being asked in March, actually. So there clearly is a, you know, people clearly do want to get away with it if they can, put it that way.
Is it about control, or is it about whether it has service potential if it's in storage? I just wonder whether control is the right word.
Does it really make a difference? I mean, you know, if it doesn't have service potential, then you impair it. Doesn't stop it being an asset, though, does it?
Yeah.
Mike, are you in on this? I mean, I think the point is, this precise point was raised in March. So I think we have to provide guidance that says clearly this is, this is an asset. If we need to describe quite how we get to that view slightly differently, okay, but I think we need it because the question was asked in the March meeting.
And you're right. And I recall the question being asked, and at the time I thought this was the way to handle it. But I audit the museum and art gallery here, and they've got 90% of their collection in storage, and there's no question they're controlled. And we do the inventory checks and we count them every year, and they're on the balance sheet. So I think maybe it's not a control question. Is they've got to be displayed on the balance sheet if they're classified as a heritage asset. So I think Todd's right. It's the control question, perhaps it's throwing him and me now.
Well, one way forward would be to provide implementation guidance on the service potential issue, whether or not it's a resource.
I don't think the service potential goes down because you got it in storage. You just decided to put it in storage and you bring it out in 2 years' time and put it back on display. Yeah.
Russ, help us out on this one.
Yeah, this is a tough one because I think we're getting into the challenge we've been dealing with for the last year and a half on all of these implementation guidance. It's kind of a bottomless pit once you start. But I think going back to the discussions the task force had, we thought the real challenge people were struggling with was they weren't sure when they actually controlled the asset or not from the recognition perspective. It was less to do with the measurement aspect. So we do have measurement coming up in other areas. And I think if you're talking about change in service potential, that's a measurement issue that it will get to later. So I think we need to determine whether this is helping with that constituent challenge that we were posed. And the question I recall from those discussions was, if having things in storage or not, do I actually control them, or am I holding them for someone else? And because of the lack of legal ownership, it wasn't clear whether I met the control criteria.
So does that help you in terms of the explanation for why it's there?
Yeah, I can understand. And maybe your suggestion of making this the last question and answer might help, because I sort of, it's the first thing you hit and you sort of think, it's a bit strange. So maybe it would help to move it down.
Okay, thanks. We'll do that. So I've got Adrienne and then Lindy.
So I've been somewhat struggling to follow this, and I got hung up on at Lynn's issue, and I wasn't sure that Lindy's proposal addresses it. For me, and I think it's relevant to all the discussion we've been having with Todd since then, I would be massively helped by by putting in somewhere, I guess in the basis for conclusions, BC1, that there's a boundary to the guidance that can be given, and it's determined by the need for judgment on the individual loan agreement. And that would address the storage issue as well, because I started from thinking, if you put it in storage, then you control it. But of course you don't, it depends on the individual agreement. So I think saying explicitly somewhere, which I think couldn't be would have to be in basis for conclusions, that you'll never get over the need for judgment. You'll have to bring in an assessment of the individual agreement in making your decision, and guidance has to stop there and hand over to judgment. Some way to put that in some form. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adrienne. And I think actually that probably, in terms of thinking about that, flipping the guidance to the end, actually then it can be couched in that way, that essentially the judgment on control is on the facts of the loan agreement and the way it's held. The fact that it's in storage has no impact on that. And that might help Todd as well, because it then sits it in the control, and we've discussed the indicators of control and so on. So, and then you can have it's on the facts of the case. Okay, thanks, Adrienne. I see thumbs up from Todd as well on that, and Bernard, which is important as chair of the task force, Bernard. Okay, so go to Lindy.
Thank you. I guess I was just going to add on the first one, because I agree that you still have control. It's just why you still have control, which is not there, which is causing the problem. And it's because I've exercised my right to restrict or deny access to the asset. And I also haven't given away any rights to the economic benefit or service potential. I still hold them. So I do think we need to explain why a bit more. then just give the answer, and that might help too.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think if we couch it, if we move it down and then we couch it in the control argument, then that makes much more sense, doesn't it? Okay.
Great.
So I'm not seeing any more comments on that one, Gwenda.
Excellent. So we'll move on to number 9.2.4, which is about subsequent expenditure as capital or expense. And this really, again, has heritage in its headlights, although we accepted that this can possibly also happen with infrastructure, where the focus of the implementation guidance is on a situation where you subsequently spend on an asset that is not recognized. And you can imagine something like the Stonehenge, and you build some kind of fence around it, or something along those lines. And so the implementation guidance is recommended, and it's shown in Appendix A. And it's actually, oops, going down there. Quite brief. It started out longer, and then we got some very helpful feedback from the task force. Should a reporting entity capitalize subsequent expenditure on an unrecognized asset when it meets the expenditure recognition requirements under IPSAS 17? And the answer is simply, basically, yes, you should. So the IPSASB is asked, do they disagree with the task force's recommendation here to provide that implementation guidance on this topic?
Okay, open the floor for comments on that one. So Mike, you're in.
Thanks, Chair. So Gwenda, was there a reason why we use the word unrecognized? Is that in the context of heritage assets, which may not be on the balance sheet because you can't measure it, but you spent some money on it? Okay.
Exactly. Good, good.
So I think that principle applies clearly for heritage, but not for infrastructure.
Yeah, it's very unlikely with infrastructure.
So go ahead.
If it's not applicable to infrastructure, that will mean some changes will need to be made to the basis for conclusions, will it? Because infrastructure is brought through at that level. I think we do need to land whether it would relate to infrastructure or not, because yeah, I would struggle with it on infrastructure. I mean, when I first read the question, I was trying to think of examples in a heritage asset sense. And I think the example you use with the fence around the Stonehenge, I'd probably class that as a separate asset to the heritage asset anyway. So I was probably struggling to think of examples where you would actually be spending on the heritage asset itself that might be unrecognised. So examples might actually help to bring the question and answer to life a bit.
Understood. I've got Lindy and Ross also on this, I think. So I'll take their comments.
Thank you. So I guess it also links back to Todd's earlier point that we don't have a principle for subsequent costs in the ED, so that would have to come in. And I guess what we debated when we looked at it, is it right that if a heritage asset hasn't been recognized, that you can capitalize subsequent costs? Because maybe there must be quite a high threshold that you can demonstrate that it does meet the definition of an asset, or will somehow enhance the service potential or the economic benefits of the asset. Because, you know, there were some questions, is it right that if it's not recognized that subsequent expenditure should be capitalized? And maybe that's something we can ask specifically.
Thanks, Lindy. Ross on this?
Yeah, so I recall the task force discussions we had on this issue. And we were talking about those heritage assets that are of historical significance, but quite old, and you might not be able to come up with an actual cost for that asset, but you'd have subsequent restoration and maintenance costs to keep the life of it working. And I remember us talking about the Great Pyramids, for example, where you might not be able to come up with their historical cost, but clearly there is subsequent expenditure to keep them in good repair that happen from time to time that are capital in nature. So you might not recognize the initial asset, but definitely the subsequent expenditure is capital in nature, and you should be recognizing that and attribute it to that asset. So that's where this is coming from. And I think that the example needs to reflect that. I don't think the fence around Stonehenge actually helps, but maintaining Stonehenge itself and keeping it in good repair with capital improvements itself would be what we'd be talking about.
So on this, then it seems like, picking up the sense of what we've heard so far, the sense is that we want this question limited to heritage items. There's some context missing probably from the basis for conclusions that talks about the fact that there might be heritage items that may not be recognised because of the sorts of issues that Ross referred to, which would make the answer then more appropriate or better explained, if you like. So with those two provisos, Mike, that address the points you were going to raise?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, it does. And for that reason, BC1, where there's a reference to infrastructure, I think can come out. Let's just focus the discussion in the BCs around heritage.
Okay, thanks. So I think instructions to staff for this needs to be limited to heritage. We need just a bit more context, which explains why heritage items might not be recognised, i.e. essentially they meet the definition of an asset, but there are measurement issues associated with them. And then there was a third point I was going to make, and I can't. Oh, that's right. It was Linda's point about actually we should probably have a specific matter for comment on this. Okay, everyone content with that as the approach? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. I'm just looking at the possibility of requiring additional disclosure on those types of expenditures that are capitalized, whereas the asset is unrecognized. So, yeah, I think for it will be useful for the users to, because the heritage asset is not capitalized, and then there is, you have now the expenditure that is capitalized relating to that asset. So even if it is reflected in the face of the financial statement, I think there should be additional disclosures to that effect, that those expenditures were incurred on an unrecognized asset. I don't know.
David, on that, I think it's quite tricky, Lucy, because we haven't defined heritage items anywhere. So putting in a requirement specifically on heritage is quite tricky. David, back on Lucy's point.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would agree with you, Chair, that it's very tricky, because if you start going down the route of saying you should, start making those disclosures, you might find yourself in the territory of asking about all other sorts of disclosures. But on the other hand, I would have thought that it should be an accounting policy note, so that you actually would disclose in your accounting policies that whilst you've been unable to measure and therefore recognise an asset, you do recognise as capital expenditure appropriate expenditure on that asset. And I think that would be enough.
So can we pick your question up again then when we get into the discussion that we are going to have later on presentation, but with that proposal from David that there, you need to have an accounting policy, and then anything material in terms of additions, you would have conventional PP&E disclosures on. That's okay? Okay, so we'll pick that point up. Good, thanks, Lucy. So, okay, and then we move on to the next item, threshold of cost to capitalise, which again, I think is you, Gwenda.
That's correct, Ian. So item 9.2.5, and we're looking at implementation guidance on use of capitalisation thresholds. And I picked, so it's in Appendix A. For this one, I didn't want to say a lot more than that, to highlight that we've got the question is what factors should be considered when choosing a capitalisation threshold, and the guidance AG1 through AG7 basically explains what a capitalisation threshold is, what it should do, and provides factors about how to set such a threshold. So this has got the task force's support. Does the IPSASB disagree with the task force's recommendation?
Thanks, Gwenda. So open up for discussion amongst the board. So I think Lynn was first, followed by Lindy, and then Camira.
So I just had a really small point, and it was on IG4. It was the very last sentence of IG4 where I didn't think we should be commenting on the cost of capital asset management systems, because you could argue the same, that often they're not very effective when you lump assets together. So I just thought the last sentence of IG4 we should delete.
I think that's a fair comment, Lynn. Anybody object to deletion of that? No, okay, so that goes. Thanks for that, Lynn. Lindy next, then Camira, then Scott.
Thank you. So just looking at how this is explained and linking it to the recognition paragraphs in IPSAS 17, certainly the way we've seen it in our jurisdiction is that this is rather about applying an accounting policy to material or immaterial items as discussed in IPSAS 3. So we actually rather see this as, you know, coming from that point that IPSAS 3 says you don't apply the standards or apply accounting policies to immaterial items. So I was wondering where, you know, challenging the conceptual arguments that was put forward, because I do think it's about materiality. And then I also wondered if we should be addressing this at this point in time, because we still are going to look at materiality at a later stage. So that was kind of my overall comments. And then I was thinking, but I don't know if we should actually include it at this point in time. Although I recognize that this is something that is quite useful, and I know a lot of constituents have asked. I guess my other concern is that it's really a fine line here that we might be creating kind of principles or even rules in this IG, looking at what is in IG5. So yeah, so I think it is going to be very useful. I was just wondering about the conceptual arguments underpinning this, and then also worrying about that we are creating a precedent here for that is more around asset management than accounting. So
thanks, Lindy. I think quite a lot of the points you just made were played out in the discussions that certainly I heard. I think on your point on timing, I think probably you're right that constituents have asked for guidance, and so probably on balance it's better that the board does give guidance now, even although there is a risk that when we come back and look at materiality, and we have said we will come back, that we end up doing some kind of revision for consistency, but it probably is better on balance to actually offer that guidance at this point, but acknowledging the risk that you know, we may have to revise it slightly. So I'm just on the point itself. David, were you coming back on the point that Lindy made?
Yeah, I was just going to say that from my experience, it's one of the things that I'm always asked about is how do I go about setting a capitalisation threshold? Except one jurisdiction I worked with who decided they didn't want one at all and would capitalise everything that met the definition of an asset, even if it only cost €1.
So, I mean, I think you were challenging the conceptual basis, though, Lindy, of providing guidance.
Yeah, we've given comment through, so I think it's just looking at maybe the ordering of some of the first IG 1 to 4, and we have sent some comment through on that already. So perhaps it's just looking at kind of starting with materiality considerations and then justifying it further.
Okay.
And I
when you go ahead, I was going to go next anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering how to acknowledge, because I got comments from Lindy, from Takeo, and also from Scott about the, so I had received comments and I was thinking of them as editorial level and didn't want to slow things down by going into that level of detail, but they were really helpful comments in terms of improving what's here and making it clearer that it's about materiality.
Okay, so it sounds like, and I'll come to Camilla and Scott in a moment, the proposal is that we do provide the guidance, but actually Lindy and the team at the South African ASB have got some proposals to you on reordering, so we will need just that small group to work on reordering and setting it in the context of materiality. So if I can then go with that instruction provisional, can I go to Camilla and Scott and then David?
No, sorry.
Thanks. I have only a comment on IG4 when we say management control over smaller capital type items should not dictate capitalization thresholds. I think it is too, a sentence is too strong. It's almost like we are telling people what to do and an implementation guidance, and it's also about management of assets. So just consider if it's necessary to keep that there. On IG5, I had trouble with the points C and D. I would suggest, because in point C, quality of reported information, we are talking about cost benefit with this, and then in the point D, we are talking also about the too low when there's a the capitalization threshold is too low, also that it creates significant work and stuff. And I think we could just merge these 2 points, because actually we are talking more or less about the same, the cost benefit relationship, and yeah, so it's just on the way of defining it. So thanks.
Thanks. And resonating with comments coming from South Africa as well. So yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like we could address that and express that better, consistent with the point Camilla has made, just by that reordering, redrafting process. Okay, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. And I was going to pull my hand back down because it is going to mention, but on IG5B, I think B, substantially all, is just another way to get at materiality. So I think we got to watch this comment as not a back boodle comment at materiality. So I think it ties into the whole materiality concept, but we ought to be careful at this particular point.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. So Gwenda, I think in terms of the instruction on the way forwards, I think the board decision is we should provide guidance at this stage, but it needs to be couched in the context of materiality. And then there's some proposals then in terms of redrafting. And I think what you need to do is work with Lindy, Camilla and Scott to just get that drafting sorted, please. Okay.
Great. Okay. So
so we move on to the next point then, 9.2.6.
Okay, so for this issue, we have the task force recommendation for implementation guidance on what is essentially a heritage measurement issue, which is whether or not when a heritage asset is perceived as being, well, actually, let me just remind myself, that's the one that yeah. This picks up on the impact of two things. One is whether when there are restrictions on heritage assets, does that in itself mean that you can't measure them and they shouldn't be recognized? And the implementation guidance is saying no. A restriction in itself does not affect it, though it acknowledges it could impact on how you measure it. And then the second part of this is, I think, the more challenging issue, which is the perception of a heritage asset being irreplaceable. And the idea, does that affect your ability to derive a current cost? And the guidance is trying to distinguish between a perception, some heritage assets having, what in one sense, they're all ways perceived as irreplaceable, but what does financial reporting look at in terms of deriving a current cost? And the guidance is trying to distinguish between an asset that is somehow unique versus a sort of part of a group, or able to be restored over time in a way that allows you to develop some kind of sense of, if you like, a replacement cost. So the task force reviewed this and provided input and then approved the implementation that you've got there. So the board is being asked, do you disagree with the task force's recommendation to include this implementation guidance in ED 78?
Thanks, Linda. So Camilla, you're first.
Thanks. Yes, well, my first comment is in relationship with the terminology. We are using current value as a technique. And well, we are discussing that in the other project. So just to be careful on that, because we are referring it to, and it is confusing. In IG1, we say that where a heritage asset has a restriction that means it cannot be sold, this means that the asset contributes to the entity's operational capacity. I think it's again too strong, because it's not necessarily if an entity is not allowed to sell the asset, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's not for operational capacity. They can also have it only for financial capacity as well. So just to be a bit careful on that. And at the end after reading the implementation guidance, the question is, okay, in those rarely cases when it is not possible to determine the current cost, then what will be the alternative? So thanks.
Thanks, Camilla. I'll pick up Ajit's comments first and then come back to you, and Todd wants to make points as well.
You want me to speak? My turn, is it?
Yeah, go ahead, Ajit.
All right, okay. I have a concern about IG2. The question is that a heritage asset is viewed as irreplaceable. Does this affect an entity's ability to derive its current cost? The answer is no. A view that heritage asset is irreplaceable does not affect an entity's ability to derive a current cost. And then only in rare and exceptional circumstances is an entity unable to derive the current cost for a heritage asset on the basis that it has a unique quality that cannot be replaced. I have concern about that sentence because I think that sentence is probably appropriate for assets that are movable. Movable heritage assets, that could be probably transactions that you could see of a similar asset, which you could identify a current cost. But in the case of immovable heritage assets, it's very rare that you could actually find another asset for which a transaction has taken place, for which, and you could identify a current cost. So you want to probably identify a large amount of immobile assets for which there are no other similar assets, for which there are no transactions have taken place. So it's so in the case of immobile assets, I think it works the other way around, where it's rare and exceptional for an entity to be able to derive a current cost, because transactions would not have taken place of a similar asset.
No, thanks, Ajit. And I go to Todd next, and then I'll come back to Gwenda. And I mean, just a general point, I think clearly this will need to be reviewed in any case, because of consistency with terminology and so on with the measurement project. So I think that's taken as read. Okay, so I've got Todd, then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. Mine, I think, is more an observation. I don't know whether there's much that we can do about it, but when I looked at paragraph 3 of the paper and sort of reflected on the concerns of our constituents, I don't know whether what we've got here is getting at the heart of the issue, which is the actual impact of a restriction on coming up with the value. And that really is, in practice, quite a difficult issue. And I know in terms of engaging valuers around this, there are a variety of outcomes that you can get depending on the valuer that you select when you are dealing with valuing something with a restriction. And I did wonder in reading that paragraph 3 of the paper whether that's one of the concerns that constituents have. And it was just my observation that we're certainly not addressing that. And as I say, I don't know whether we can, but it is a very real issue, how you actually deal with restrictions when it comes to putting a value on things.
Thanks, Todd. I'll come back to David and David in a minute on that one, because it does strike me that actually partly how you handle it here is very much dependent on how the text lands in terms of ED77. So I'll go to Lindy next, and then I'll just summarise where we've got at that point. Okay.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm going to say the same thing. I think the questions should be addressed, but I don't think we quite know what's going to be in the techniques to actually be able to say, yes, we've nailed it here. So I think we would have to look at it again.
Okay, thanks, Lindy. So I think where we get to so far is there's some comments on IG1 that Chimera has made that need to be picked up. I think to an extent what you've just suggested, Lindy, is going to go to some of the points that Ajith made as well on IG2, that we do need to have a look at that again. And I think, you know, Todd's points are around that as well. Gwenda, any observations? And then I'll go to David and David, because I do think, you know, as Lindy said, some of the answer is going to be what text we've got in ED77.
Yes, I have broadly 2 responses. One is thank you to Chimera, Ajit, and also Scott hit the same issue, I believe, as Ajit, this phrase rare and exceptional, and he emailed that to me. And I'm always amazed when you think you've got a good paragraph, when people such as the board look at it and identify sentences that, in my sense, I suddenly think, yes, they're not only unhelpful, but they're unnecessary. So I think there's an editorial aspect that can be done here without changing the later, more substantial guidance. So thank you for that feedback. I think there are a couple of sentences that basically need to be taken out. And in terms of Todd's comment, I think, yes, I understand the issue of the impact on measurement. What this guidance is really doing is saying you should be able to measure it, and not addressing how complex it might be. And it's basically still hitting this, it's measurable issue, which has been such a big issue for heritage. And And it does then relate to what Lindy was saying about and being in sync with the measurement project. So that's some work to keep in touch with in terms of going forward. I hope that's answered your concerns.
Yeah. Dave and David, is there anything you want to add at this stage other than, you know?
Yeah, I think so. If you don't mind, Ian. I mean, restrictions. Valuers are used to dealing with restrictions when it comes to certain restrictions related to property, plant, and equipment that are not heritage assets. I mean, so if they're valuing land or and buildings, I mean, okay, I mean, Todd's right. I mean, you will get a variety of answers, but on those sorts of assets, I suspect that the difference between the various answers isn't going to be particularly significant, because they're used to working in that sort of area. When it comes to heritage assets, it's different. So they need to understand what the restrictions are. And normally, from my experience working with the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors on heritage several years ago, they're either valuing them for sale. So if you're valuing them for sale, there aren't any restrictions because somebody can sell it, or they're going to be valuing it for an insurance purpose. Now, I don't know what they actually would do in terms of restrictions when they're valuing it for an insurance purpose. So I think the answer is here that Dave and I will have to get in touch with either David Tretton or Steve Choi from our task force and tap their expertise and see what we can find out and feed it into Gwenda.
Okay, thanks, David. That sounds like a sensible way forward. So I've got Adrienne, then Mike.
So I guess I do take issue with Gwenda's general message, which is you should be able to find a value. And I think what Todd was saying that I have a lot of sympathy for is it's so complex. And in many cases, you just may not be able to find a value. And that's covered by Gwenda's write-up, but she gives the impression that that'll be rare. And I think there's a tone, maybe it's just editorial or drafting or something, but to change the tone, not to dismiss, as in, don't, you guys shouldn't be taken aback by the complexity, because go ahead and put a value on things. Whereas I think what Todd was saying, and I feel strongly about, is the message should be, it's very complex. There won't be much way around the complexity, but where possible, try and find a value. So I don't know how you'd reflect that, but I think it's a drafting point. Thank you.
I think you're right, Adrienne. I mean, I think in discussions, and I don't know, Bernard, if you want to come in on this one, I think we were conscious that what we don't want to do is give people the sense of, we can say it's all too difficult and then we don't have to do it, which you do get in my experience. And so we were trying to achieve actually, really, you should be able to value these things. You should have a go at it. Because from an accountability point of view, actually what gets measured gets managed. So that was so I think there is a tone thing, but in a sense what we're saying is these things are assets like any other, and you should actually measure them.
Now, what you said there, Ian, is perfect, but it's not in the draft.
Okay. So there's a tone thing. Bernard, you want to come in, and then I'll go to Mike.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, no, I totally acknowledge the points that have been made, and I think the complexity absolutely is there. But at the same time, I think there are not many jurisdictions currently who have really practice in trying to measure those heritage items. And I think that the question around the replaceability also kind of comes back to what we try to put a point of focus on. Then it has to be the service potential to the entity. So depending on what the service potential of the entity is, it might be able to be replaced with a similar item. All right. So if you have a collection of coins and you display the collection of coins, and some of them, are not in a status where you can display them anymore in a good conscience, you might be able to acquire other ones from the same period. But if it's the one particular coin you want to display, then probably it's gonna be irreplaceable in that sense. And I think there's a lot of finding a way to manage those heritage items, and then actually derive the accounting policy depending on what your approach to managing it. And at the same time, I think we also, I do fully agree with the restrictions, but there are a lot of restrictions around other items as well. So my country currently is trying to sell fighter planes, and there are a couple of restrictions on those as well. So I think it's also about developing the methodology, and I think we have to be conscious that we can't do this in the standard, but we can give as much guidance as possible, I think, for, like David said, valuers actually to do their craft and actually try to find ways around coming up with valuations for those.
Okay, so Mike, then Scott.
Thanks, Chair. So I'm listening to the conversation with interest, and it's all very helpful. Thank you. But I didn't raise the issue of restrictions yesterday when we were chatting about the conceptual framework discussion, and we'll come back to that on Tuesday. And I want to make sure that I can use the word restrictions in the right place at the right time, because restrictions on the use on the way land may be used that's got a hospital on it, and how do you value that restriction has got one outcome. Restriction on a piece of heritage asset that you've got control over and you've got indefinite use for a long period of time, I can't get a feel for what the restriction might or might not be. So I'm just cautious about how we use this term restriction in terms of infrastructure assets as against heritage assets.
Thanks, Mike. See some sympathy for that. Scott, and then I'll sum up.
Thank you, Ian. Maybe just a suggestion that may not work or not, but I know my experience of working with clients in this area is they try to take a historical model and valuing in this, and it's a precision issue to a large degree. So I don't know if there's, think of all the other estimates in the financial statements and all the imprecision. Trust me, as an auditor, you take a hard swallow sometime when you look at what those numbers are. And so we may just want to remind people of that the financial statements is full of a lot of estimates, and this is just another one of those estimates, and the precision will vary depending on the availability of information. So there is a way maybe to help the preparers, but also help the auditors on the other side to be more lenient about what they accept. Just a thought on that.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, that's helpful, and that I think comes back to the overall tone. And there's probably something on what you've said there that needs to go maybe in a sense in the basis for conclusions, which might strike the right balance on this. So I mean, I think clearly we need to get valuation, the professional valuation input to the way we take this forward. There are Mike's concerns over the use of the term restrictions. I think we just need to acknowledge that. And then we've got various other points that have been made during the discussion that need to be picked up. So generally the IGs are in the right place, but tone and some drafting that needs to be picked up. Okay.
Thanks, that's really helpful from a staff point of view.
Okay. Thanks, Gwenda. So I think we'll try and pick one more issue up today, which is over to you, Ammon, on 9.2.7.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. So the issue that we're about to address now is the issue of separating land from infrastructure assets. Constituents questioned whether land and infrastructure assets should be separately accounted for because land is integral to the operation of infrastructure assets. The task force deliberated this issue during this quarter, and the task force is of the view that no additional guidance should be recommended for separately accounting land from infrastructure assets, because IPSAS 17 guidance is clear that land and buildings are separate assets that should be separately accounted for and valued, and roads, buildings, land, electrical equipment are separate classes of property, plant and equipment, that should be separately disclosed as well. So I would like to find out if the IPSASB disagree with this task force recommendation.
Thanks, Simon. No, I think we're fine with that.
Okay, that was quick, thank you. Then we'll move on to the next issue on valuing land under infrastructure assets. Once again, constituents highlighted the issue of valuing land under infrastructure assets because land or railways is situated in location. And so the constituents asked us to look if we should add guidance. The task force deliberated this issue and noted that there is guidance in IPSAS 17, which indicates that specialized assets should be measured at current value using the depreciated replacement cost technique. However, the task force was also cognizant that additional guidance should be added from an implementation perspective, because there are instances where if there's no locational requirement for road and railways, including the land underneath it, current value is based on comparable land situated at an alternative site. And if there's a social policy decision which requires land to be situated in a specific area, therefore the current values of that existing site should be used. So for example, if land passes through agricultural land or agricultural area, then the current value should be based on agricultural values. And if land passes through an industrial area, the current value should be based on the industrial values. So we've also drafted basis for conclusions to reflect this decision, and would also like to find out if the IPSASB disagrees with this task force recommendation.
Thanks, Simon. So open for comments from members. Todd.
Thanks, Ian. I really struggle with IG2 in this notion that in valuing land, you can, if there's no locational requirement in terms of replacing that asset, that you'd value land somewhere else. Certainly in the New Zealand jurisdiction, you value the land that is there, and we don't entertain the idea that you can put a value on that land that's there that is based on some notional land in another place. So I'm really struggling with IG2 based on my experience. It doesn't make logical sense to me to be coming up with a value for land somewhere else that could be probably lower than the value of the land where the asset actually is located currently.
Thanks, Todd. Perhaps I could go to either David or Dave on that. I mean, looking at it, I wonder if actually we're better off being silent on that one and therefore deleting that.
Shall I come in?
Yeah, David, if you can.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fully sympathise with Todd's point, because I mean, it is mind-boggling to sort of think that if you're looking at infrastructure, there's not going to be a locational requirement. I mean, in rare circumstances, I suppose you might decide that the road shouldn't go from A to B, it should go from A to C. But I think the circumstances would be so rare that maybe you're right, Chairman, and we should just be silent on it and delete IG2. I don't know whether board members would agree with that.
Would any? I mean, I see some thumbs up on that. Lynn, are you on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was. I think wouldn't we? This is a matter for the valuers from some respects, but I have come across instances in practice that here we're talking about locational factor, but I have also come across instances where your modern equivalent asset might require a smaller size of land. So does that mean we're at the smaller size of land? So your modern equivalent asset might not be to replace the 10 carriageway highway. Your modern equivalent might be a 4 carriageway highway for the sake of an argument, or you might have a railway system where the modern equivalent is on a smaller gauge or something. So it might not always be the same size of land. And I have come across this in practice where the valuers are adamant that if the modern equivalent asset requires a smaller land mass, then you value a smaller land mass. And I've always struggled with that, because conceptually you own a size of land and yet you value on your balance sheet a smaller size of land for your modern equivalent asset. So I sort of struggled a bit with IG2 generally, but I have seen it in practice where the valuers do say take into account locational factors and also the modern equivalent size of land. And so I don't think it's for us as an accounting board necessarily to opine on how valuers do their jobs. And I just wonder if we are slightly here.
So, I mean, you wouldn't disagree then, Lynn, with deleting IG2. I mean, I think the other thing to say is obviously is certainly we do have some coverage of the sort of modern equivalent asset issue in ED 77. So it's not that we won't have guidance on that anywhere, but it does seem that we are getting ourselves into a problem that we don't need by including IG2. So I think if we, the proposal, and I saw thumbs up for this, is we should delete IG2. We do deal with modern equivalent assets in ED 77. So I think being silent on it here is probably the best course. And I guess also, in just speaking from my own experience, and I'll come back to you in a moment, Todd, the question was really, well, can I value the land on the road and how do I do it? And it was only in the context of the existing asset rather than, a potential modern equivalent, whatever. Todd?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when it comes to a modern equivalent asset, entirely agree when it comes to, the infrastructure that might be on or under the land. But I think when it comes to the land is the land. So in the example of the road that was 10 lanes down to 4, yes, if you would only ever replace the 10 lane with 4, then you would take that into account for the road itself. But if you have land that's larger, I think you need to value the full extent of the land. I think that is quite important. And I don't think it's a matter of valuers are going to do it differently or not. I think we need to be clear about what we want for financial reporting purposes, and then the valuers can follow that. But, I feel quite strongly about the land issue and, making sure that you value the full amount of the land.
I mean, just before we get into a kind of very complex debate about valuation, I think you're right, Todd, in terms of, basically you've got the land of that width and that's what you're valuing, and if you can sell it off, there is a sort of surplus issue here, but probably, I think let's just be silent on it here. So I think we will delete IG2, I think, is the upshot, because it's getting us into all these problems. Now, is there anything else we need to correct here if IG2 goes? And that, I think, is the question to Lynn, and then final comment to Mark.
So I won't prolong the debate. I have a lot of sympathy with what Todd is saying. In practice, valuers are valuing the smaller piece. Whether or not that's transparent, I don't know, and whether or not we want to pick that up and somewhere else on a discussion of modern equivalent asset, maybe we should.
Okay, well, I think we're saying IG2 goes. We will, we're going to have a look at the ME model equivalent asset value anyway. So I think, for now, let's drop the issue, and let's, if people feel strongly at some later stage, then we'll have another look when we've got firmer guidance in ED 77. Mark, then Lindy, but just bear in mind that we are now over time, so I want to wrap us up on this issue. Mark, as Task Force Chair on this.
Yeah, just shortly, I think this discussion we had now in the board is mirroring a little bit the discussion we had in the task force. We there started with other versions, like start with adjacent land and making adjustments, but I think we could ultimately, even in the task force, not agree what's the right valuation method. And I definitely think we should leave it to the preparers, because we can't come up with a solution. So I fully support the deletion.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Lindy, final word.
Thank you. I guess my response to that is, if you look at IG3, it kind of contrasts what you say in IG2. So if you delete IG2, you probably have to delete IG3, and then I don't know if we need this at all. So,
Well, I think we do need something, because this is a real problem in practice as to whether you actually value the land on the roads. And so it's actually, it is an important thing where we need some guidance. I think we note your caveat that there may be some work on IG3 needed if we delete IG2, but I think it still is important that we have the guidance, because I know personally I've met this in practice and it's tricky. David.
No, I'm trying to lower my hand. I agree with what you said.
Okay, we'll take it that your hand is lowered. Okay, so I think with that, we delete IG2. The instruction to staff is then just a further review of IG3 to see if there's consequentials from deleting IG2 that need to be made. So with that, I think we wrap today's session up. I think we've made good progress in the approval of ED 79, subject to those things to come back on Tuesday. We're making, I think we're on track in terms of progress through this item. So we'll carry on this item tomorrow. We will then return to measurement after we've completed discussions on this item. I'm just interested, Michelle's obviously about to make a quick getaway. Yeah, welcome back tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you then, and Michelle, safe travels in the meantime.
I have to go just now for another conf call with the IC.
Okay.
Ride safe.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.